Cool. So, yeah, who wants to learn what's happened in PHP in the last 3 months? Perfect. So, one of the really exciting things that happened was they actually been working on like the process to get new RFCs in the system. For anyone who's not aware, the way like PHP moves forward is they have like an RFC process. A bunch of people can then propose like an RFC, like, oh, I want types in PHP, and then they have to like list why they want it, and then there's like a big discussion around it with all the like internal people who develop it, and then they have a vote on the RFC, and if the vote passes, then it gets implemented and it goes into the new version. So what happened is, what they used to have was for any like real like core language features, you needed to get a 2/3 margin of like agree we should implement this RFC before it got in. But then for some other like kind of arbitrary RFCs, they would let it in with like 50% +1 votes. And they abolished that because it was just weird and unnecessary to kind of distinguish between those two types of features. And they also changed the minimum voting period. You used to be able to create an RFC for like, oh, I want this cool new language feature, but I'm only going to give you a week to vote on it. So then not everyone gets into vote. So then like some big features that require a lot of discussion like might get through without enough kind of due process to make sure that it's like going to be good. So now they've made that 2 weeks minimum period, which is good. The other great thing that's happened is 7.4 is getting really close to being released. I think it's in beta 3 at the moment. So I think the first release candidate gets released like next month or next week or something like that. So there's no more new features. And if you've been to the last few talks, I've actually gone over pretty in depth most of the 7.4 features that have come out. These are my 3 favorite ones so far. One is typed properties. So like when you're declaring a property of a class, you can just put its type straight in there. The reason I'm excited about that is now I no longer need to have getters and setters to enforce type safety in my like value objects, which is really cool. So hopefully there'll be a lot of like automatic tools that can go through and take your like @var comments, like your dot comments, and just like whack the type in there, so you don't have to go through and change like 30,000 classes manually. So that'll be horrible. Preloading is an awesome feature where you like hook into like PHP FPM or Apache, and you essentially give it a list of PHP files that it needs to load into the op cache before anything happens, which means that every time you get a new request, you no longer have to load in Symfony or Laravel into the op cache before you can actually do anything. It's already there. So then like that whole boot up time of PHP, which everyone that doesn't like PHP raves on about being terrible, that just doesn't exist anymore because you've got your whole framework. You can load like your entire code base straight into the op cache and just have it sitting in memory, ready to go as soon as a request comes in. And I'm not sure if I was wrong last time, but in the last meetup, I said arrow functions were coming in PHP 8, but it's actually in 7.4, which is really cool. Essentially, when you have like a closure, when you define like an anonymous function, you can now use arrow functions similar to JavaScript. There are a few like caveats around like when you can and can't use it, but it should make a lot of like really simple closures much easier to read. That being said, there's still a couple of new 7.4 features that came in post the last meetup, which I'll run over. They're mostly small ones, but one is you can have this underscore separator in any numeric number, like any number that you have, you can just put an underscore in it wherever you want, and it just gets ignored. But it just allows you to like make it easier to read when you've just got like magic numbers throughout your code base. If that didn't have underscores in it, there's no way you'd know that was a million, or it's actually a billion. I can't even read it now. Maybe they need some other sort of separator in there. But yes, that's pretty interesting. Also, something that I found out the other day when I was researching this is if you're using date times and you're calculating the gap between 2 date times, and those 2 date times stretch across a transition between daylight saving and non-daylight saving time, so when the clock goes forward or backwards an hour, it didn't really work very well, mostly because there was no unit tests around that specific edge case, and also because there's 3 different ways that you can create date times. This first way up here is when you're creating a date time, you just specify like your offset from GMT, which means PHP has no idea like what the actual time zone you are in. So it can't tell if you've transitioned from daylight saving to non-daylight saving time. So it just essentially ignores that. This way here, even though you're giving it like the acronym for the time zone, still ignores it. Internally, it just stores it as the offset. So it can't actually do daylight saving calculation for you. However, if you do this way and you actually pass in your actual date time, technically it can calculate time zone differences across daylight saving times, but it didn't do it correctly because there was no unit tests. So in 7.4, there's unit tests and it works correctly, which is great. I have no idea where that O recreate it comes from, but that is invalid and that should be picked up by a syntax checker.
So 7.4 give a different time difference than 7.3.
It's 7.4 will give you the correct difference between two times.
Yeah.
If it's 7.3 will be wrong, yes. Like only in like certain weird edge cases. On the RFC they list off a couple of edge cases, but it's not like common. It's only if you're like calculating a time between like before daylight saving time come in and after daylight saving times come in, and then you calculate the difference between that, it'll be like on or off by an hour sort of thing, which is really strange, but fixed once you upgrade. Also, I didn't know, but in Postgres, you can have this like extra question mark character just in your SQL. I don't know exactly what it means in Postgres, but it's just an operator that you can use in Postgres to do different things. It's not like a wildcard that you would put in a search query like MySQL. And you were just completely unable to use that with PHP until now because the question mark character in PDO is a placeholder for like your bind-in parameters. So you just couldn't use that feature. But now you can pass in double question marks like that, and then that passes through a single question mark, if that makes sense. So you can see this SQL query here will then get run like this on Postgres.
What's it used for?
It's mainly to do with JSON stuff, I think. It's like an operator to deal with JSON columns and things like that. Like I know MySQL has some weird syntax around like you have to have backticks and like arrows and stuff when you're dealing with JSON columns. And that is how Postgres does it. I don't exactly know how it works, so they haven't used Postgres, but we digress. And also, in I think it was 7 or 7.1, we got this spread operator that comes in, which allows you to unpack an array. So you can use that as like a parameter in a function. So you can say, I want a list of users. So you say user ... users, and then you can force that this function takes in like a variable number of user arguments. Now you can use this like array unpack thing inside an array declaration, which just means you don't need to use like array merge or anything anymore. It also gives you like the ability to put in merging your arrays in like specific spots and things like that, which is really cool. And then the other things that came in that are coming in 7.4 is they're just deprecating like a ton of stuff. There's one RFC that's got like 20 different things that are deprecated in it, largely just things that are either undocumented or just like bad ways of doing things, like passing in an object to the inArray method, for instance. They're getting deprecated so they can clean it up in PHP 8, which is really exciting. But there's a couple of kind of bigger deprecations that I'm going to point out. The first one is, if you've ever seen a ternary that looks like this, I very much pity you because it does not look like fun. But also, it almost certainly does not work the way you expect it. It's, according to the RFC, Nikita, the core developer who proposed this, is like, anytime you see that, it's almost certainly a bug because it doesn't work the way you think it does. The way PHP does it is left associative, I think is the word. But if you look at the way these parentheses are, it essentially does it the wrong way around than what you'd expect. Whereas like literally every other programming language, no one that I've found a comment of was able to name a programming language that does it this way. Everyone else does it the other way. It makes it left associative instead of right associative. So it happens the opposite direction. It took me a long time staring at that exact code to understand which way it happens, but just keep in mind that it happens the wrong way. The way that you expect it to happen, it doesn't work until you get to 7.4 and then you're good. I mean, 8. 7.4 will give you a deprecation warning. Also, something that I didn't know was you can technically access objects or elements in an array with curly brackets. Did anyone actually know that? Has anyone used it? Yeah, I don't know. It's apparently works the same as square brackets, except with some extra features removed. Like you can't, down here, you can't like instantiate an array with curly brackets, but you can access elements with curly brackets. And it's not really documented anywhere, so they're deprecating it, which makes sense. And then since last time, there's only been one new feature that's come into PHP 8 so far. And that is you get fatal errors when you have incompatible method signatures. This is a really weird one because in PHP 7, for instance, if you've defined an interface and then you have a class that implements that interface, but your method signature doesn't match, you'll get a fatal error. But if you have a class and then you have a child class that defines the same method with an invalid method signature, you get a warning and PHP continues like everything is roses until you actually call that method and then it blows up. I think. Like it probably blows up if you expect it to be two different things. But anyway, that's going to be a fatal error in PHP 8 because it doesn't make any sense. So something else, this came out like a month after the last meetup. One of the guys that works for Packagist analyzes the Packagist logs for whenever someone Composer installs something. And so we can know what PHP versions people use with Composer. Which is really interesting because you can see like 7.2 is growing quite dramatically. All of the lower like 5.3, 5.4, they're all dropping off like pretty steadily. The one thing these stats don't take into account is PHP projects that don't use Composer, like most WordPress installations, for instance. But it does give a pretty good snapshot over like what other PHP developers are using, I guess. And then you've got this like over time, you can see as each new version comes in, it picks up at like the exact same rate. Like everyone wants the new version pretty quickly, but the old versions still hang around for a very long time.
And would you say that people who are using an older version probably aren't using Composer as well? Like a really old version?
Yeah, probably not. Like if you're using like, yeah.
For some reason, Composer won't run on my PHP 4 server.
Yeah, I wonder why. Yeah. Also, stop using a PHP 4 server. And then there's another guy that does framework trends. So he analyzes that Composer API, Packagist API, I should say, to figure out like how many people are installing different frameworks. So then he has to do a bunch of like canceling out because Symfony has like 50 different packages which are used by other frameworks and stuff like that. So he cancels them all out to try and figure out how many people are using each framework or like just large library in the case of Doctrine. But you can see like Symfony and Laravel are up there pretty high. And then all the other ones are like growing as well, which is good. So a couple of bits of news from different PHP frameworks that have happened. React PHP is no longer in beta. It was in beta for 7 years.
For lack of confidence.
Yeah. Apparently, their blog post says that it's been production ready and battle tested for a couple of years now, but they just released V1 on the 7th anniversary of releasing V0.1. So it's got like a 24-month LTS. So I don't know, give it a shot. I've never tried it. Yeah, I've had 7 years. What have I been doing? Man. Symfony has released Symfony Cloud, which is kind of just like lets you host your Symfony application, very like low effort. Essentially, you give them your Symfony application, you tell them I want a database, I want Redis, and it just does everything for you, which is really interesting. It's been 2 years in beta, but they've fully released it now. And then Laravel has done something interesting. They've got Laravel Vapor, which is it runs on top of your own AWS account, but it runs Laravel in a Lambda, so like actually serverless. So you don't actually pay unless your code is running on the Lambda function. You still have to pay Vapor like $39 a month for the privilege of this, but it runs on top of your AWS, so you've got full control of everything as well. It's really interesting. Laravel also released Laravel Nova, which allows you to make like admin pages like really easily, built into your application. It's one of the better admin panels like libraries I've ever seen. And then they've also released Laravel version 6, which I'm super excited about. Even though they haven't released any new features, all they've done is move to semantic versioning, which is amazing because I was very mad when they moved away from semantic versioning because it's ridiculous. But, and they're using semantic versioning. So get to version 6 and we're all good. Then things won't break, hopefully. But anyway, that is all of my news. Does anybody have any questions about any of that? Cool. Guess we're up to the next talk then.
Quick question.
Yes?
Are the slides available afterwards?
Yeah. So all of the slides will be linked on the GitHub issue that Tom mentioned before. So yeah, you can find them. I've also written a blog post that goes along with this if you want more details about each thing as well.
Does Laravel 5.8 become 6 now if there's no new features?
Yeah, so like the 5.8 still exists, but you can upgrade to 6 without breaking anything, and then you get semantic versioning as well. So yeah, it's interesting because prior to V6, the major version number meant like a paradigm shifting change in Laravel. Like when that's what their whole idea was. I think they used romantic versioning or something they called it. So like the
Right. Terrible because everything else is semantic versioning.
Right, it just makes no sense. But anyway, yeah, the major version number was meant to mean like we've just changed the entire way that Laravel works. So it's got a lot of people confused because they're like, why has Laravel changed everything? When they haven't, they've just moved to semantic versioning, which is a good thing. Cool.